I was raised in a non-church going home. I didn't spend any time praying. I believed in God and probably would have called myself a Christian. My mother none of us were believers. We didn't know the gospel, but my mother was praying, and when I was in my teen years, I had 3 siblings. My older brother was 15, I was 14, younger brother, younger sister. My mom was increasingly feeling guilty that she had not brought her children up to attend church, and she prayed, and the Lord often answers the prayers of unbelievers. If they're petitioning the Lord, they don't even know the gospel, but they're calling out to Him. He answered in a remarkable way, in that a friend who had, since my mom knew her, come to the Lord, had a conversation with my mom and shared her faith with my mom, and recommended a church that we would go to. We were in Northern California in the Bay Area, and so we ended up just at the age of 14, my freshman in high school, for the first time attending church, and it was an evangelical free church in Walnut Creek, California. Within a space of a few months of that, my entire family of 6, came to the Lord. We were all baptized on the same day. And so things changed for me in my high school year. It was a little weird. It was one of those sofa talk experiences where my parents got the kids together and said, "We're going to church on Sunday." And we're like, "Okay, whatever, we'll go to church." But the Lord got all of us, and we're all still walking in the Lord. 4 years later, I'm 4 years old in the Lord, I went to UC Berkeley, enrolled at UC Berkeley to study chemical engineering, which is not, by the way, a Christian school. And for the first time, I think worldview was on my radar, because I realized, okay, for these 4 years, have been reading Scripture and coming to an understanding of reality, and I'm getting a different vibe from this place that's not necessarily coming from Scripture. And in particular, there was a chemistry professor who used the chemistry podium as a pulpit to sort of preach against faith and preach against Christianity in a chemistry lecture of all things. Who would have thunk? But thermodynamics lecture, he used it as an opportunity to bash on arguments for the existence of God. And I didn't, at the time, feel inclined to raise my hand and challenge him, and I didn't go to office hours. But I felt stirred. I didn't find anything in his argument to be compelling. In fact, I found it to be not at all compelling, and I felt as though someone should answer it, and I felt as though people like this should not be able to put this out there without someone having a good answer. And so I think that was the beginning for me of stirrings of apologetic activity and praying about it, and eventually the Lord called me into that, and I was not expecting that at the time. But I got an opportunity after studying chemical engineering in graduate school to start to move into biology, because I saw this profound connection between engineering and biology for the first time. I was not at all turned on by biology in high school biology. There it was just dissecting, pickled frogs and naming the bones. And I thought, how boring is this? But when I was looking at life at the molecular level, at the subcellular level, I thought, this is engineering. And not only that, it's remarkable engineering, far beyond any engineering that humans do. And it really, really fascinated me. It also touched back on this apologetic strand, and I started to think, hang on, if this looks so much like engineering, like superhuman engineering, then it probably is engineering. Is there any way that I could show this? Is there anything I could do in the lab that would actually demonstrate that this is a design thing and it's not an evolved thing? And so doors opened as I started to pursue that, and I got an opportunity to actually build a research program around just that sort of question. I also got an opportunity in 2015 to write a book after spending decades on this, answering the question, is life an accident or is it intended? It is intended, it's not an accident. So that's the bottom line. You can go now. No. I got an opportunity to write a book, and different strategies for writing the book occurred to me. One could be that I could take this technical work and distill it down for a non-technical audience and write that kind of a book. But I felt as though that would be playing into the hands of people who would like you to believe that this is at heart a technical question, that you need a PhD to know whether we are cosmic accidents or not. And I firmly believe you do not need a PhD to know whether we are cosmic accidents or not. I think that is a matter of common sense. We can know that with certainty without having special educational training, without having expertise. And so I really felt as though the way to approach a book is to show that instead, to show that this is really a common sense issue and that we can all be very certain that we are made by a personal creator God. And then bring in some science as well to show, now that you know that, and you don't need a PhD to know it, by the way, you can go into the lab and actually confirm it. And anything that you hear coming out of the scientific community that says otherwise is actually distorting the science. That's what I want to tell you. But you can only be confident of that if you know, as a non-expert, no, I know that this is true and this is how I know it. And then you're immune to all the claims to the contrary. So that was the point of the book. I want to just quickly give you some evidence that smart people, highly educated, brilliant people who are working in a certain field can still come to stupid conclusions. It is possible. One of the earliest questions addressed by the ancient philosophers is the question of existence. What is the nature of existence? What are the things that exist? What does it mean to exist? And one of the early luminaries, you won't have heard of this guy, but he was one of these brilliant Greek philosophers, Gorgias, who spent his life on that very question, the question of existence, and pondered it for decades and wrote extensively on it. And he came to this conclusion after decades of work. Now, I'm guessing that you know he was wrong, okay? And you didn't spend nearly as much time on this question as he did. So here's a simple example of something where expertise does not necessarily drive you in the right direction. It can get you so caught up in a technical thing that you actually lose track of the common sense thing. Common sense tells you he got it wrong, okay? Now, there's something very much like that I think is happening in Origins, on the origins question. And by that, I don't mean just the origin of life. I mean the origin of all the different kinds of life. So it's a bigger question than scientists think the origin of life is just that first cell that came out of the primordial ooze. But we're talking about the origin of all the different kinds of life. Those are all origins questions. And on this, I believe it is also the case that simple experience and simple common sense reasoning actually leads you more faithfully to the basic truth. I'm not saying you know all technical truths in common sense. You don't know about quantum mechanics through common sense, but you know the answers to the biggest and most important questions through common sense. And this has actually been affirmed by interesting quarters. Alison Gopnik is a psychology professor at UC Berkeley. And as I was working on the book, I came across this quote by her. She said, "By elementary school age, children start to invoke an ultimate godlike designer to explain the complexity of the world around them, even children brought up as atheists." And I thought, that's interesting. Because what that means is it's not parental indoctrination that's causing a 4-year-old to know when he or she looks at a butterfly that was made by a godlike designer. It's something innate, that we all get this. And it actually must be the indoctrination that later convinces that 4-year-old turned into a 14-year-old, turned into a 24-year-old, that, oh no, that's an evolved thing that wasn't made by a godlike designer. At least it opens up that possibility. That quote comes from this article in the Wall Street Journal where Gopnik was not saying this approvingly. She was saying this is a bad thing because kids think that life came from a godlike designer. It causes problems for us when we try to teach them where life really came from, and we have to undo all this bad thinking. So we should start earlier with 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and start to show them that life should not be thought of that way, that actually there's a technical explanation for life, and that way it causes less frustration for high school teachers and college teachers. Well, if she's right, if Gopnik is right, and the 4-year-olds are wrong, then the picture looks like this, doesn't it? It's an elitist view of science. We are all down here on the lowlands, but the elite educated experts are up there in the ivory tower. They understand the truth about such important questions as where did we come from, what are we, and where are we going. The rest of us, if we want to know the correct answers, we'll have our own sort of prejudicial, naive, common sense answers. But if we want to know the truth, we depend on them. We have to look up to the ivory tower, and they will dispense their wisdom, and we will either receive it or not. But if the 4-year-olds are right, the true picture looks more like this, right? Okay? Everybody on these big matters has an innate knowledge of what's true, and they either fight against it or they don't, but they know what's true, and the academy has dug themselves into a hole by coming up with an alternative explanation, an alternative version of the truth, and the more they dig, the more they're stuck. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, if you're in the academy, it is not easy to get out of that hole, because if you buck against the system, you get punished or removed from the system. So it becomes something where they're stuck in a way of thinking they really can't get out. And yet, people who aren't in that situation see just fine. It reminds me, it might remind you, of a certain children's story about an emperor who had no clothes. So in that story, it really is about this elitist problem that the people who are most concerned about appearances are the most liable to be party to a fallacy and to perpetuate it just because they don't want to look stupid. But children, typically, who aren't worried about that, they don't care what they look like. They just call a spade a spade. It would take a child to say, hey, he's not wearing any clothes. And of course, the adults all know that too, right? But they're pretending because they don't want to be thought foolish. I think the situation is very similar. There are then there's a big divide between two understandings of reality, specifically the question of where everything came from. There is the theistic understanding, and that is that God is the uncreated creator of all things. He has always existed, and through his work, the physical universe exists and we exist, and he's responsible for all of it. Then there's the materialistic view opposed to this, which says, no, the arrow goes in the other direction and God's not in the picture. There's the physical universe, and lots of debate that we've heard of today about where that came from. Did it come from a multiverse or what? But the physical universe created us. It made us. We came out of physics, and there is no God. Two very different pictures. Now, there's a blend of these that's called theistic evolution, and we've heard this mentioned today too. And that is, you could say, well, we don't agree with this because we believe in God, so we're going to add God to the picture and make it look like this. And this is my sort of shorthand version for theistic evolution position. It still holds that physics is enough to make us, right? But it holds that God made the physical universe. So overall, he's responsible, but the physical universe does have the potential to make complex life and intelligent life. I'm not going to tackle all the problems with this, and they are all tackled in this volume, which I think was commended to you earlier. Theistic evolution, scientific, philosophical, and theological critique. Yes, it's jogging my memory. John referred to this, and he couldn't come up with the scientific. He said it's a philosophical, theological, and some other category. I don't remember what it was. Scientific. So I have a chapter in this. It's a very good volume that covers all the problems, doctrinal dominoes that start to fall if you go this direction of theistic evolution. I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do instead is say there are two serious problems here. There are two obvious, I won't say they're obvious, they're commonsensical ways to know that the physical universe cannot have made us, okay? So if that's true, then this picture is wrong. And the materialist picture is wrong. They're both wrong because physics cannot give you us. I'm going to give you two arguments, neither of which requires expertise, but they do require some careful thinking. One is called the argument from introspection. In other words, looking within about, what does it feel like to be a human? What do we think we're doing, right? So introspection, looking within. And the other is an argument from observation, looking at the outside world, right? Okay, and they both show that this cannot be true. The physical universe cannot make us. So let's start with this argument from introspection. I'm going to start by thinking about human thought. These bottles these days. So, we can't really do anything without thinking, right? I don't think we can do anything without thinking. But did you ever think about thinking in this respect? Did you ever think, how do we know that we can think? Okay? We think we're thinking. How do we know that we can think? And it's actually a harder question to answer than you might think. Because it seems as though we have to actually assume, we have to actually hope that we're not badly deluded in order to think, right? We have to hope that we're not a brain in a vat, or that we're not deeply, deeply confused, that we're not insane, right? Because I have to take some confidence, I have to take a step of hope or confidence in thought in order to start thinking, and none of my thinking can then validate that step, right? Because if I am deluded, then all of this is nonsense and I'm going nowhere. The fact that I think I'm going somewhere doesn't actually prove that I'm going somewhere. If I'm deluded and crazy, then I'm not going anywhere, right? So you have to just take on faith that human thought is a valid enterprise. And that doesn't mean that we're saying that all humans are thinking correctly or all human arguments are correct. Not at all. It's simply saying, is it a valid exercise for humans to think? And for me in particular, you're saying it for yourself. Everyone's saying, is it a valid exercise for me to think about things? And it turns out you have to hope that it is, and you can't prove that it is. Because again, the only way we prove anything is by thinking, but if thinking is not valid, then you can't think, right? So you have to just hope that it is. There's no other way to do this. And that's true for everyone. You go on faith that thought is a reasonable thing to pursue, not that it's flawless, but that if we apply ourselves carefully and we check with others, we have some hope of getting to the truth by thinking carefully. That's something that we have to take on faith. If we do, all kinds of things open up for us, like science. We can start to do science, but there's something else that we have to take on faith to do science. So suppose I can think, I'm not insane, I'm not deluded. Well, suppose I can think and I'm not insane, but suppose someone's tricking me, and all of this, I think you're out there, and I think this world is out there, but suppose that's, did anyone see The Matrix? You get into kind of weird space here where weird stuff is being piped into your head, and it's not true, someone else is playing, giving me fake data, then science is out of the question. I can't do science unless I also take on faith that the real world is real. It's out there, that you're out there, that there's an outside world, that I'm not being tricked. So I can think and I'm not being tricked. The real world is really out there. Now I can start to do science. But I have to take these two things on faith. And notice that even once I start doing science, I can't prove that either of these is true. I still have to take them on faith. Because if I'm being tricked, or if I'm crazy or deluded, none of my scientific experiments are worth anything, right? Or nothing I read is worth anything. It's all a mirage. It's all fake. But if I take these two things to be true on faith, and that's the only way I can take them to be true, then I can embark upon this project of trying to explain the natural world, and that's what we do as scientists. Now consider this. We've taken these things to be true on faith, and we come up with a particular explanation, a scientific explanation, okay, that we publish and we write books on it, and we think it's science. Suppose that explanation, whatever it is, has implications for human thought, for my confidence in the validity of human thought. And suppose it undermines my confidence in the validity of human thought, so that I lose if I take this explanation seriously, I would have to abandon all confidence in the legitimacy of human thought, which would make me abandon all confidence in science, which would make me abandon confidence in the very explanation that I'm entertaining, right? That would be what's called a self-defeating explanation. Because if I take it seriously, it makes me throw away everything that I had to take on faith in order to get to it, which means it can't be taken seriously. Do you get that? It's self-defeating in that respect. Okay, here is an example of a self-defeating scientific proposition. It has to do with, well, at least in my book, I've introduced it by thinking about numbers. And there was a real experience I had in the 8th grade. The finest public school teacher I ever had was my 8th grade math teacher. And one day he stumped the class by saying, "Where are numbers?" And we're thinking, What do you mean by that? He said, where are our numbers? And we said, well, they're in our book. They're on the blackboard. And he said, those are numerals. Those are symbols for numbers. I'm asking, where are numbers? Where are the things that those are symbols for? And we were thinking, what is this guy after? Eventually, a girl in the class said, they're in our heads. And he said, that's where numbers are. Now, he's using heads figuratively because numbers are not literally in our heads, right? He meant they're in our minds, right? And we often use the word head when we mean mind. I'm very careful with my kids to distinguish those. Mind and head, mind and brain. So in the book, I have this thought experiment. Suppose you are in a brain imaging lab and there's all kinds of, probes on your head and all kinds of instrumentation. This can even be futuristic. It could have far more instrumentation than is possible today. But let's pretend that they can image absolutely everything that's happening in your brain in real time and show it up on a display. They can see everything that's going on in there. And this scientist who's got all this stuff on your head says, asks you to count from 1 to 10, and you count, and he says, think about these numbers, you count, you're counting, he stops you at 2, and he or she says, here's the image that we got when you said 2. See the activated region there in the frontal lobe? Is that what you mean when you say 2? And you say, maybe that was activated in my brain, but that's not what I mean when I say 2. He's saying, I'm trying to pinpoint what you mean when you say 2. And you say, I don't mean that. I mean a number, the number after 1. And he says, no, I'm a physicalist. There is nothing outside the physical universe. There is only the physical universe, which means whatever you mean when you say 2, it has to be something physical. So I'm just trying to find out what it is that you mean when you say 2. And you say, I'm not meaning something physical. I'm talking about an idea. It's not to be found in my head. Well, let's zero in a little more specifically. I saw this. We captured data on this particular synapse that fired between these neurons in this cluster of your frontal lobe in that red region of your brain when you were thinking of the number 2. Is that what you mean when you say 2? And you say, no, you don't get it. There's nothing in my brain that I mean when I say 2. I'm thinking of a number, okay? And if they were to insist, a team of these scientists were to say, no, there is nothing but the physical world. So what do you mean when you say 2? I would say if you insist that what I mean when I say 2 doesn't exist, then I am insane. And all the words that I'm using, if they don't mean anything, if you're telling me the things that I think they mean don't exist, then you're saying I'm confused deeply about what I mean when I'm using words, which means I'm deeply confused. And that means I do lose all confidence in my thinking project. I thought I could think, but if you're telling me I'm confused about everything I'm saying, then I can't think, okay? So this is exactly what we mean by self-refuting scientific proposition. We're left with these two options. Either I am manipulating concepts, non-physical ideas, when I think, or I am being manipulated by neurons. I'm being tricked into thinking that I'm doing that. But if I'm being tricked into thinking that I'm doing it, I don't even know if neurons exist. I don't know if labs exist. I don't know if science exists. All of it is gone if I can't think, because now I've lost confidence in the very thing that I needed to do in order to get there, right? So I can rule out B. That cannot be true without exploding the whole thing. Everything implodes. If I accept or I try to accept that I'm being deceived by neurons into thinking I'm thinking, then neurons don't even exist. I'm just confused. That is precisely this situation. B self-destructs, and it leaves you with A. I am manipulating concepts. Concepts are not physical. I am working with ideas when I think. There is no other coherent way to understand thought. So we have to have this picture of reality. There is a material realm. We're not denying that our brains are physical. We're not denying the physical world. But there has to be this mental, immaterial realm above it. And a thinker has to be one of these special places in the universe where these two things come together, where there is the immaterial me, the thinker that is not material, that by God's divine hand, there's a marriage between this immaterial thought and thinker world that touches my brain and becomes actions that live out in the physical world. And the other way, too. So I see you only because physical light is coming into my eyes, impinging on my brain, and then popped up into the mental realm. And someone has to be in charge of that interface between the two. And it can't be material because my ideas cannot be physical. And I don't know how to run a brain. Do you know how to run a brain? I don't have the faintest idea how to work a brain. So I'm not the one who's doing that. Someone else is doing this, taking my thoughts and pushing them into the physical brain so that I can move the physical world, so that I can talk with you and you can talk with me. This is a proof of the incoherence of physicalism and materialism. And by the way, we've talked about multiverse and talked about problems with multiverse. Here's a proof that the multiverse can't explain reality, because physics can't explain reality, and all you have in multiverse is physics. We are not physical. We're not purely physical. We have physical bodies, but our minds are not physical. Second argument is the argument from observation. It's one of many, but I have built the argument in Undeniables around an argument that I call an argument from coincidence. And the reason I talk about coincidence is it turns out that humans, even if they have no technical training, have an uncanny ability to spot things that cannot be, they're too implausible to be attributed to coincidence. So we're happy to deal with certain things as being, attribute certain things to coincidence, but we easily see things that can't just be a coincidence. And you do not need any technical training. You don't need to be very old to do this. So I think this is what the 4-year-old is doing when the 4-year-old looks at the butterfly. So let me make this concrete. If you were sitting with someone who had a red piece of paper and they crumpled it up and threw it on the table and it looked like this, you could say, or I could say, that reminds me of the head of an elephant. Do you see the trunk, the big head, the ears? But it's not spooky, right? You would think, oh my goodness, how did you make the head of an elephant by crumpling up red paper? Because you have to sort of impose the head of an elephant on that, right? It's not compelling. You can see it when I point it out, but it's not really that remarkable, is it? Whereas if you see this red piece of paper on a table, you know somebody has done something to that piece of paper. If a 4-year-old who had never experienced origami, had never done anything with origami, never seen an origami crane before, came into a room, there's no one in the room, and they see that on the table, they know, he or she knows that someone did that, right? Someone made that, and they also think, I want to know how to do that, right? That's the way kids think. And that's what I think is going on from the age of 1 in humans. We have an uncanny ability to recognize the things that required know-how in order to do. And we recognize them because we're in the business of wanting to know how, right? So we see the things that are clever. Sister, brother, mom, dad did that. I want to do that. That's how we're wired automatically. From the cradle, we are thinking that way. And so we automatically spot the things that require cleverness to do because we're clever and we want to do them. Okay, another illustration I use to talk about coincidence is alphabet soup in the book. And it's a good way to talk about coincidence because if you pour yourself a bowl of alphabet soup, anybody had any of this recently? I haven't had it recently, but we used to do this as kids. Alphabet soup, kids are looking for words, right? Or they try to spell their name or something in alphabet soup. And if you just pour this randomly at random, there's going to be words, and we're perfectly happy to attribute those to coincidence, right? So 3-letter word, there'll be short words. They're messy. It's C. It's a short word, but it's kind of a messy version of C. So you're not at all spooked by seeing that. It's not like, oh my goodness, a message from God. C in my alphabet soup. May, again, it's messy. The A's upside down, short words. There's a 4-letter word, but it's even more messy, right? Rose, you have to kind of curve it around. Coincidence. We're very happy to attribute these to coincidence. When I gave this talk, someone pointed out holy. Do you see holy under C there? H-O-L-Y. Now that is no coincidence. No, that is a coincidence. But If you were to lift the lid on a pot of alphabet soup and see this, you would know that is not a coincidence, okay? So, and a 4-year-old would know this. So what I want to ask here is, we all get this. Is it possible to actually show, could you bring a team of scientists in here and say, yeah, not only do we all know this, but we can prove that the 4-year-old's right. That can't happen by coincidence. Is there a way to do that? And there is. You use the math of probability. There's a very simple sort of analysis you do. So for this, I would put a grid of squares over the picture, and the grid squares are about the size of the letters in this alphabet soup, and there's 23 grid squares, and there's something somewhat special about all 23 squares. In 5 of them, you have the 5 letters that spell pasta. In the other, 18, you have these relatively cleared zones that make the pasta letters, the pasta word pop, right? They pop because there's a clearing, and then you get the 5 letters in there. So there's something special going on in all 23 of these squares. And we could just, with a rough calculation, ask ourselves, how special is what's happening in those 23 squares relative to the rest of the alphabet soup surface? And it turns out, if we say those 18 squares that are cleared are like 1 in 10 unusual, and all we're saying there is you'd have to look at quite a big region of this random soup to find a cleared spot, at least 1 in 10, but we'll just use 1 in 10. And the 5 that have the letters that spell pasta are like 1 in 100 unusual, because they have not only a letter in them, but the letter is oriented the correct way. It's not upside down, it's right way up. And the letters spell a word, so it's somewhat special. We'll call it 1 in 100 special. If that's true, if these numbers are, and they don't have to be exactly right, the whole pattern is 1 in 10 to the 18th, and that's for the 1 in 10 special for the 18 cleared squares, times 100 to the 5th unusual. The 1 in 100 is for the letter squares. And if you multiply that out, it's 1 in 10 octillion unusual. So this simple calculation, and a scientist would say, yeah, that's about right. You would need to pour 10 octillion bowls of alphabet soup in order for something like that to come out just by coincidence. And you will never, God help us, you will never pour 10 octillion bowls of alphabet. If all the oceans were alphabet soup, it would not give you 10 octillion bowls of alphabet soup. So that's why we know that someone did it. There's no way that could happen by accident. It's really the same reasoning with the origami crane when the 4-year-old sees that. The number of steps you have to go through to get that crane, and even with these directions, you're probably not going to get it right, okay? The number of steps you have to go through to get an origami crane is too numerous, and each step requires too much precision in order for that to happen by accident. You don't need a calculator in the end, because whether it's 10 octillion or, far beyond that, you don't need the number. It just can't happen. And that's why these things are so obvious. That's why you don't need to be an expert. Well, there's another category for which this is true and obvious. And it's a category that I call in the book inventions. And I mean something more specific. I mean, it's obviously a common word. We know what an invention is. But I mean something that has this property that I call functional coherence. So this is what I say is kind of the hallmark of what we would call an invention. It has this sort of structure to it. It is a top-level thing that does something clever, and in order to do that clever thing, it has all kinds of things arranged within it in order for it to do that. So it's parts within parts. The top-level thing is the thing that does the high-level function. It has components within it, each of which has components all the way down to the elementary constituents. And this looks more sort of technical than it is. I mean, if you take a text message and you send like a sentence in your phone, by your phone, you send a text to someone to tell them to meet you somewhere at a certain time, or you'll be here, meet me here at this time. You've done this. You've invented something. You've arranged letters at the bottom level to make words and phrases and ultimately the whole content of that sentence. You've done exactly this. You've arranged things in a hierarchical order, and each of those letters is there in order to make the right word, in order to make the right sentence, in order to convey the meaning, right? So it's something very common. We do this all the time. It's also true of the stuff of technology. So if you look at a digital camera, you don't have to take this apart to know that it must have a lot going on inside it, and it has to have parts within parts that are all making this top-level function of point this at something, push the button, and a picture of the thing appears. And a 4-year-old knows when they see this, he or she knows, that's someone clever did this, someone knew what they were doing because of what it's doing. Now, the 4-year-old could also take it apart, but probably not get it back together. And you would find that it does indeed have all these parts within parts. And I can't tell you what all of these are doing, but I guarantee you they're there for a reason, and the reason is that top-level function of the camera, right? So we have this kind of sophistication happening whenever we look at something that is performing a high-level function, and it's intuitive. We know when we see something doing that, somebody did something clever here, and I don't understand it all, but someone did something clever to arrange things, because that's the only way you can get these things to work this way. Well, if that's true of something this sophisticated, imagine how much more true it is of something this sophisticated, right? We are bodies now, so we are talking about the physical part of us, not our minds. We are remarkable, and there's a top-level sense in which we are what we were made to be, and if you're a biologist or if you take an anatomy class or a cell biology class, you know that remarkableness goes down layer after layer after layer after layer. Yes, our bodies are composed of parts called organs, and every one of those organs is composed of parts called tissues. So if we look at you see two little eyeballs staring at you over the right arm there. If we look at one eye, you have the retina, the cornea, the sclera, the vasculature, all of these different tissues that are a part of the eye, each arranged in order for the eye to perform its function of receiving visual signal and sending it through the optic nerve to the brain. And the eye, along with all these other organs, is there in order for us to be what we're supposed to be, to live as humans. You can look at any one of these tissues, you see a remarkable cell structure that allows the tissue to do what it's supposed to do. So the retina has the rod and the cone cells that you know of. These are the light-receiving, light-sensitive cells. Each of those cells has its own internal structure, and you can keep drilling down and down and down in biology, all the way down to single molecules. This is a monster protein RNA complex called the ribosome. This is the molecular machine that builds proteins by reading the genetic instruction on an RNA. You don't need to worry about all these terms, just look at it, okay? That's more sophisticated than an origami crane. So this is the level that I have been looking at life for many years now, looking at individual protein molecules and asking whether they themselves are too remarkable to be coincidences. Because you have to arrange this machine is reading along an RNA that came off of a DNA gene, and that has sequence instructions, and this is the machine that is reading those instructions and putting amino acids to play, connecting them to form a long chain of amino acids that is sequenced according to the genetic sequence on the gene, in order for this long chain to fold up and form one of these, a single protein molecule with these really elegant three-dimensional forms. There's thousands of these forms that have been cataloged now. I'm just showing you a few so you can get an idea of how sort of visually attractive they are, but also how varied they are. They come in all kinds of different shapes, and those shapes are critical for what they do. So a lot of these do chemistry. They are molecular machine parts. You saw a diagram of the flagellum. All of those pieces of flagellum are protein chains that fold up to the right form to make that flagellar motor. And the question that I was asking when I embarked on this at the protein level was, how hard is it to get a bunch of amino acids? How fussy is the order of these amino acids in this chain in order for it to form a shape that will actually work in a cell? Can you just mess it up and does it not care what order? Or is it more like a text message where if you just randomly hit buttons, you're not going to communicate anything, right? You have to get it. It's not that you have to have it exactly right. My wife has this habit of not proofing her text message, and I get it and I go, what are you trying to say here? It's actually made worse by the fact that your phone is trying to interpret what you meant. Oh, I think you meant this. If you don't go back and read it, that's not at all what I meant. It would be easier if I had just normal typos, but it's got these weird word insertions. Is the living world at a molecular level as fussy about these strings as we are as readers when we send a text message, or is it much more tolerant? Well, I embarked on a set of experiments to measure that, and I used this particular protein. This is an enzyme called beta-lactamase. This is the enzyme that allows bacteria to survive in the presence of penicillin antibiotics. So it's a bad enzyme for us. It's a good enzyme if you're a bacterium, but I don't see any bacteria out there, so let's just say it's bad. What I did in the lab is to randomize the amino acids in various regions of this enzyme and then put the genes, so I made millions of genes, put those genes in bacteria, and then put the bacteria on Petri dishes that had a little bit of penicillin antibiotic. And if they could grow and form a colony, that means this thing is still working. And if they couldn't, that means it wasn't working. So it allowed me to count. It allowed me to determine, to score what fraction of these messed up genes work and what fraction don't work. And then I could just do a calculations. Well, so that means if you messed up the whole thing, what fraction would work and what fraction wouldn't work. And that's work that was reported in this journal, the Journal of Molecular Biology, back in 2004. I want to do a quick illustration. This is the last talk of the day. So I could go till dinner time. I want to do a quick illustration of this. If we think about this, if we think about the challenge for a Darwinian explanation of life as being a blind process coming up with one of these clever proteins, how hard would it be for a blind process to do this? It's kind of like blindfolded throwing a dart and trying to hit a target, a dartboard, right? I don't know where it is. I'm just shooting in the dart, throw the dart, it lands somewhere. What are the odds that it's going to land in a place that will actually do the trick? And to illustrate that, I do this illustration where we use laser. I need a volunteer for this. It's not dangerous. At least so far, it hasn't been dangerous. If I have a volunteer, where did I put my laser? Yeah, dude, I heard you. Yeah, I trust you. You will. Okay. Oh, here it is. No, can I get a different? No, kidding. Yeah, come on. Come on. We're going to do this. Okay. Now, the way I usually do this, it involves two laser pointers. You get one and I get one. We're not fighting each other. Okay? So it's not going to be that fun. I usually use the ceiling as a target, but this is such a complex and black ceiling. So that what we're going to do is you're going to point your laser beam on that wall. And so caution to people sitting in that section, just be facing that way. But he's going to try not to point it at you, but he's not going to be opening his eyes. So if you just face that way, you won't get a laser beam in your eyes, preferably. Okay, so you're going to take your laser and point it around at this wall, but you're not going to be watching because I'm going to have a target laser dot on that wall, and we're going to see if you can just by chance hit the target, okay? So I have to get my target set up here and turn my laser beam on and then put it on that wall, and then you have to not watch, and we're going to see if just by chance, okay, so I'm prepared to do this. Maybe I'm going to turn this around this way. And then I need to give you your, so I'm prepared to do this. Now you're not, I know you're watching now, but I'm going to move it, and yours works this way, so try that. You just push that button. Okay, so you see where that wall is. Okay, now I want you to close your eyes. Are his eyes closed? And I'm going to put a target here. Okay, our target is there. Can you, but make sure you're not blinding anyone. So you're just going for that wall, not all the walls, right? And go a little more slowly. We're having trouble following your dot. Oh, so a little higher so you don't blind anyone. Okay. And you're doing such a fast wander that we're having trouble tracking your dot. If you do it slowly, do a little slowly here. It doesn't matter. He's not going to hit it. it's, a- it's actually... Okay, now you can open your eyes. See, I had my dot over here. It did slightly shift, I think. Yeah, so if you open your eyes, you can get it, right? But if you're... Okay, so a big applause for my wonderful volunteer. Thank you, sir. But you don't get to keep the laser pointer. Oh, it looks like you got a cool place to keep a laser pointer on your arm there. That's very cool. Okay, thank you. So, what made that difficult in terms of geometry? What made it difficult? Yeah. We can't see where you're going, but what if the laser dots were 10 feet in diameter? Then he would have hit it, right? So it's that it's a big wall, and it's a tiny dot, right? So it's a tiny dot on a big wall. It's that ratio. So if you have a smaller dot on a bigger wall, it gets harder and harder and harder, right? And so if you want to think of this as doing on a ceiling, which I usually do, the hardest thing that I could think of on a ceiling would be to use this ceiling, which is the largest ceiling in the world. I used to live up here in Seattle. Now I live up there in Seattle. This is the Boeing Everett plant where they make 737s. I think it's 737. And it is the largest building in the world in terms of volume. So I believe this is the largest ceiling in the world in terms of square meterage or square footage. So if you can imagine getting all the fuselages out of there and removing all the walls and having our volunteer with a laser pointer blindfolded and having one dot somewhere on that ceiling, you could spend years, right, without your 2 points converging, right, because it's just so big. And that is not nearly as hard as the problem of hitting this dot to get one of these protein folds right. The number, if you want the probability for getting the protein fold, is 1 in 10 to the 77th power. That's 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. A little bit worse than that, but I got tired of saying trillions. So it's like having laser dots the size of hydrogen atoms. That's a very small laser dot. And the ceiling would be the size of the backdrop of the visible universe. Okay? All right? Think about that. One dot, hydrogen atom, hidden at the backdrop of the visible universe, and something blindly searching that huge shell, hoping that these two hydrogen atoms... Oh, you were close. You were so close. But it's just not going to happen. Obviously not going to happen. Okay, now, you know and I know that if you go and tell this to someone who believes that Darwinism works, you're going to get all kinds of, did he talk about this? Did he tell you about that? You're going to get all kinds of attempts to intimidate you into thinking that that can't be right. And it will be a shift towards saying, this is an expert. The experts know about this. Believe me, I'm a molecular biologist. I know stuff that you don't know. And Axe told you this stuff, but I'm an expert and you're not. And he deceived you. Here's how I want to make this just very simple so that you know what you're saying and you know that it's true and that no one can pull that stunt on you. The bottom line is the magnitude of the coincidence depends only on the cleverness of the arrangement. It only depends on that structure of functional coherence that I showed you, that hierarchy. Once we know that we're talking about something that has that kind of structure, a hierarchy of parts within parts that performs a high-level function, we know that it takes an extremely special arrangement of parts. And nobody contests this. Richard Dawkins has admitted this. You could jumble cells together at random for billions of years and not once would you get a conglomerate. This is quoting Dawkins. Not once would you get a conglomeration that burrows or swims or flies or does anything even remotely working to keep the organism alive. That's what Richard Dawkins said in The Blind Watchmaker. Everybody acknowledges this. He thinks that you can do this step by step to make that astronomical improbability become less of an improbability. That's what he and all the Darwinists think solves the problem. They think it looks like this. Yes, that's a special destination that evolution takes organisms to that's fantastically improbable in one leap, but it didn't happen in one leap. It was stepping stones that took you there. But, track me here, if the target destination is fantastically small compared to all the possible destinations, how likely do you think stepping stones are to take you there? The same in probability. It doesn't change the problem at all. Dawkins has never got this. They don't get this. It does not change that probability at all. In the end, you are talking about a coincidence. And if the coincidence is beyond a certain magnitude, then it cannot happen. It's an impossible coincidence. You're just playing the shell game. You're disguising your coincidence. Here's a simple way to see it. These are the things that show functional coherence, this striking arrangement of parts within parts because they have such a high-level function. Everyone acknowledges, even the atheists, even Dawkins acknowledge, they look like the work of genius. Everybody acknowledges that. What Dawkins says is, but there's another explanation. But here's his other explanation. It is to appeal to things, physics and chance, which do not do the works of genius normally. If you think they do, show me chance doing a work of genius, show me physics doing a work of genius. Nobody has ever come up with a demonstration. So, the claim that the actual cause of life is that lower thing, the swirl of pure physics, of accident, and that accident just happens in this case to have done a work of genius, is precisely a claim of coincidence, because accidents don't normally do the work of genius. If you think that's wrong, show me an accident that does a work of genius. Nobody has ever shown it. They say that life is the example. That's the whole point of the question. You're begging the question. We don't believe it. In any case, whether they agree with you or not, it is a claim of coincidence. And the math of coincidence is the math of improbability. And when things are that sophisticated, that much parts within parts to achieve a high-level function, the numbers simply show you that this is an impossible coincidence. It cannot happen by coincidence. It's fantastically impossible. The only solution is to rule out that and say they look like works of genius because that's exactly what they are. And I will leave it at that and hopefully have a little bit of time for questions.